In the glittering, gaslit ballrooms of Mayfair, every young lady dances to the same breathless tune of ambition. But what happens when the most powerful man in England, weary of hollow flattery and painted smiles, rests his gaze not on the belle of the ball, but on the quiet woman standing in the shadows? Can a gentle heart, hidden away by society's shallow judgment, become the very anchor a duke never knew he needed? Prepare yourselves for a tale of quiet grace, unspoken longing, and a love that blooms where the world least expects it. The ballroom of the Earl of Westmoreland's London townhouse was a stifling sea of crushed silk, heavy perfumes, and desperate ambitions. From her customary vantage point near the towering marble pillars, Marian Linfield watched the vibrant whirl of the waltz with a profound, untroubled calm. The chandeliers overhead cast a brilliant, unforgiving light on the young women parading before the ton's most eligible bachelors. But the illumination rarely reached the shadows where Marian stood. Her gloved hands rested lightly atop the smooth silver handle of her walking cane, leaning just enough to ease the dull, familiar ache in her right leg. At 26, Marian had long ago made her peace with her place in society. Born with a hip that had never quite aligned, leaving her with a pronounced and permanent limp, she had learned early on that the marriage mart was a market of physical perfection. She was not bitter, in fact, she found a certain quiet freedom in her invisibility. While other women her age were subjected to the exhaustive, humiliating rituals of courtship, Marian was permitted to simply observe. Her family, possessing both great wealth and a deep well of affection, had never made her feel like a burden. Even now, her younger sister, the radiant and universally adored Flora, caught her eye from across the dance floor and offered a bright, encouraging smile. Marian returned it warmly, genuinely pleased to see her sister shining so brightly. Yet, as the evening dragged on, Marian's attention drifted from the dancers to the periphery of the room, where a quiet, imposing figure had been standing for the better part of an hour. Gideon Vance, the Duke of Kenshire, was a man who commanded the attention of an entire room without uttering a single word. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by the faint, distinguished frost of his 34 years, he possessed a stillness that felt entirely out of place amidst the frantic energy of the ball. Marian had heard the whispers, of course. He was the prize of the season, a man of staggering wealth and influence, relentlessly hunted by every matchmaking mother in London. But as Marian observed him from her quiet corner, she did not see a proud aristocrat reveling in his power. She saw a man who looked profoundly, soul-achingly tired. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant as he nodded politely to a dowager who was aggressively pushing her giggling daughter into his line of sight. There was a hollow exhaustion in the set of his shoulders that resonated with Marian in a way she had not anticipated. And then, quite suddenly, his gaze shifted over the heads of the crowd and landed directly upon her. Marian's breath hitched, a sudden alarming flutter of vulnerability taking root in her chest. She was accustomed to eyes sliding over her, to being politely ignored or offered a brief, pitying smile. But the Duke's gaze was neither dismissive nor pitiful. It was piercingly observant, a steady, unblinking assessment that made her feel entirely, terrifyingly seen. For a long moment, she could not look away, caught in the gravity of his quiet attention. It was only when a boisterous group of young lords moved between them that the spell was broken, allowing Marian to release a shaky breath and retreat further into the shadows. By midnight, the ache in her leg had transitioned from a dull throb to a sharp, insistent pain. Knowing her parents and Flora were entirely absorbed in the festivities, Marian quietly slipped away from the main ballroom. She navigated the crowded corridors with practiced ease, her cane tapping softly against the polished floors until she found sanctuary in a dimly lit alcove tucked behind a pair of heavy velvet drapes and a row of large potted ferns. It was cool and quiet here, a temporary reprieve from the overwhelming sensory assault of the ton. With a grateful sigh, she sank onto the small brocade-covered bench, resting her cane against her knee and closing her eyes. She had only been resting for a few minutes when the heavy velvet drapes were suddenly thrust aside. Marian's eyes snapped open to see the Duke of Kenshire stepping into the small, secluded space. He looked over his shoulder, his expression tight with irritation, clearly seeking an escape from the relentless pursuit of the ballroom. When he turned back and saw Marian sitting in the shadows, he froze. A flicker of surprise crossed his composed features, followed instantly by the polite mask of a gentleman caught intruding. "Forgive me," Gideon said, his voice a low, rich baritone that seemed to vibrate in the small space. He took a half-step backward, preparing to leave. "I was unaware this alcove was occupied. I shall leave you to your peace." Normally, a young woman in Marian's position would have been expected to stammer, to rise awkwardly, or to eagerly invite him to stay in hopes of securing his favor. But Marian had spent her entire life outside the normal rules of courtship. She had no designs on his title, no hope of securing his hand, and therefore absolutely no reason to be intimidated by him. "If you retreat any further into those ferns, Your Grace, I am afraid you shall have to take root," Marian said, her tone mild and conversational, though a faint smile touched the corners of her lips. Gideon paused, his hand still holding the heavy velvet drape. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the tension in his jaw seemed to ease by a fraction. "I confess," he murmured, stepping fully into the alcove and letting the drape fall shut behind him, becoming a permanent fixture of Lord Westmoreland's foliage, is beginning to sound infinitely preferable to returning to that ballroom. "It is a particularly relentless evening," Marian agreed, adjusting her skirts slightly to make room, though she did not offer him a seat. It would be entirely improper. Yet the seclusion of the alcove made the rigid rules of society feel strangely distant. "I observed Lady Danbury attempting to introduce her 3 nieces to you all at once. A tactical maneuver worthy of the finest generals." A genuine, startlingly attractive huff of laughter escaped him. It was a quiet sound, but it entirely transformed his face, smoothing the severe lines of exhaustion. "You are observant, Miss?" "Linfield," she provided calmly. "Marian Linfield. And I am only observant because I have the luxury of standing still. When one is not required to participate in the dance, one sees the entire choreography of the room quite clearly." Gideon's gaze dropped briefly, respectfully, to the silver handle of the cane resting against her knee before returning to her eyes. There was no pity in his expression, only a profound, dawning curiosity. He leaned slightly against the wall opposite her, crossing his arms over his chest. "And what does your vantage point tell you about me, Miss Linfield? Aside from my desperate need to escape the local flora." "It tells me that you are weary, Your Grace," Marian said softly, the gentle honesty in her voice entirely devoid of judgment. "It tells me that you are surrounded by hundreds of people, yet you find yourself entirely alone in the crowd. And it tells me that you are searching for something genuine in a room built entirely of glass and gilt." Gideon stared at her, the silence in the small alcove stretching between them, thick and resonant. No one spoke to him this way. No one looked past the title, the wealth, the coronet, to see the man underneath. He had spent weeks in London surrounded by beautiful, perfectly polished women who repeated the same rehearsed flattery. And yet here, hidden away in a shadowed alcove, a quiet woman with a walking cane had dismantled his defenses with a few simple, honest words. "You are a remarkably perceptive woman, Miss Linfield," he finally said, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register. "I am merely practical, Your Grace," she replied, picking up her cane and preparing to rise, aware that she had already lingered too long in his unchaperoned company. "I wish you luck with your botanical camouflage for the remainder of the evening." He stepped aside to let her pass, his eyes never leaving her face. As she moved back out into the bright, noisy corridor, she felt the weight of his gaze following her, thoughtful and intense, until she melted back into the safety of the crowd. Marian returned home that night convinced the encounter was nothing more than a strange, isolated moment, a brief intersection of 2 people hiding from the same exhausting world. She slept soundly, secure in the knowledge that a man like the Duke of Kenshire belonged to a sphere she would never inhabit. But the following morning, long before the fashionable hour for calling, the heavy brass knocker of the Linfield townhouse sounded through the quiet halls. Marian was in the morning room organizing the weekly ledgers for her charity school when the imposing family butler stepped through the doorway, carrying a silver salver. "A caller, Miss Marian," the butler announced, his normally impassive voice colored with a rare note of astonishment. Marian frowned, setting down her pen. "Surely they are here for Flora? She is still abed." "No, miss," the butler replied, extending the tray toward her. Resting upon the gleaming silver was a heavy, cream-colored card bearing the unmistakable crest of the Duke of Kenshire. His Grace was quite specific. "He has asked to see you." Marian stared at the heavy, cream-colored card resting upon the silver salver, her mind entirely blank. For a woman who prided herself on her composure, the sudden, erratic rhythm of her heart was a deeply unwelcome sensation. It was a mistake, of course. It had to be. A man like Gideon Vance, the Duke of Kenshire, did not make morning calls upon the quiet, limping sister of the season's most celebrated beauty. He had likely come to inquire after Flora and had simply asked for Marian in a moment of distracted politeness, perhaps recalling their brief, unconventional exchange in the alcove the night before. Gathering her composure like a protective cloak, Marian smoothed the skirts of her simple day dress, retrieved her cane, and made her way toward the formal drawing room. She paused in the doorway, bracing herself for the inevitable moment when his face would fall upon realizing she was not the sister he sought. The Duke was standing by the tall, mullioned windows, his broad shoulders bathed in the soft morning light. In the harsh glare of the ballroom, he had appeared formidable, almost severe. But here, dressed in an impeccably tailored coat of dark superfine and a simple, unadorned cravat, he looked remarkably grounded. As the rustle of her skirts announced her arrival, he turned. There was no flash of disappointment in his dark eyes, no polite masking of a mistake. Instead, his gaze warmed with a quiet, undeniable satisfaction that sent a dangerous thrill straight through Marian's carefully constructed defenses. Her mother, who was seated by the fireplace with a forgotten piece of embroidery resting in her lap, looked completely bewildered by the Duke's singular focus on her eldest daughter. "Miss Linfield," Gideon said, bowing deeply. His voice, stripped of the ballroom's exhaustion, was rich and steady. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion at such an early hour. I found myself thinking of our conversation last night, and I wish to assure myself that you had recovered from the relentless choreography of the evening." Marian moved further into the room, leaning slightly on her cane, her mind racing to categorize his intentions. He was an intelligent man. Perhaps he simply sought the novelty of a woman who would not flatter him, a neutral sounding board in a city built on artifice. She could provide that, she decided. She could be a friend, so long as she strictly policed her own heart. "You are very kind, Your Grace. I am quite recovered, though I suspect my survival is due more to my retreat behind the ferns than to my own fortitude." A faint smile touched his lips, transforming the austere planes of his face. "I, too, survived the night, though just barely. The weather this morning is exceptionally fine. With your mother's permission, would you care to show me your family's gardens?" Mrs. Linfield, recovering her wits, quickly murmured her assent, gesturing toward the French doors that opened onto the expansive stone terrace. As they stepped out into the crisp, sunlit air, Marian felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Walking with anyone outside her immediate family was always a precarious endeavor. Most people, especially tall, able-bodied men like the Duke, possessed a natural, sweeping stride that left her struggling in their wake, acutely aware of the awkward, uneven drag of her right leg. She hated the feeling of being a burden, of forcing others to halt and wait for her to catch up. She braced herself, gripping the silver handle of her cane, preparing to offer a polite excuse should the physical disparity become too humiliating. But the humiliation never came. As they descended the shallow stone steps onto the gravel path, Gideon began to walk. He did not make a show of hesitating, nor did he offer his arm in a way that might suggest she was an invalid in need of support. Instead, he simply, seamlessly adjusted his natural rhythm. He shortened his long stride, measuring his steps to perfectly match the uneven, deliberate cadence of her cane. He did not look at her feet. He did not mention the slow pace. He merely walked beside her, his large frame relaxed, granting her the immense, silent dignity of an equal pacing. Marian's breath caught in her throat. It was a gesture so subtle, so entirely devoid of pity or performative chivalry that it nearly brought tears to her eyes. In that quiet, measured walk, the Duke of Kenshire dismantled years of her deeply ingrained self-consciousness. When I arrived, Gideon began, his gaze scanning the blooming rose bushes before settling warmly upon her face. Your butler mentioned I had interrupted you at your ledgers. I must confess, I have rarely met a lady who voluntarily spends her morning poring over accounts. What enterprise holds your attention so thoroughly? Marian hesitated, unaccustomed to discussing her private passions with members of the haute ton. Most aristocrats viewed charity as a fashionable pastime, a way to display benevolence without ever dirtying their gloves. But the genuine interest in his voice, coupled with the profound respect he had just shown her, prompted her to answer honestly. I manage a parish school in the eastern districts, Your Grace. It is designed for children whose families cannot afford the basic fees of a dame school. We provide them with a hot meal, clean clothes, and an education in reading, mathematics, and simple trades. Gideon's eyebrows rose, not in polite dismissal, but in acute intellectual intrigue. That is a considerable undertaking. Do you merely fund it, or are you involved in its administration? I am the primary administrator, she said, her voice strengthening with quiet pride. My father generously provides the lease for the building, but I source the materials, hire the instructors, and balance the quarterly budgets. I was in fact reviewing the coal expenditure for the upcoming winter when you arrived. The prices have risen, and I fear we must find a way to economize without leaving the classrooms bitterly cold. For the next half hour, as they strolled the winding paths of the garden, Gideon did not speak to her of poetry, or the weather, or the idle gossip of Mayfair. He spoke to her of supply lines, of educational philosophy, and of the moral obligations of the privileged classes. He asked pointed, intelligent questions that challenged her, and he listened to her answers with an absolute, unwavering reverence that made Marian feel as though her mind were a precious, fascinating landscape he was eager to explore. He treated her not as a fragile creature to be coddled, nor as a social obligation to be endured, but as an absolute intellectual equal. As they circled back toward the stone terrace, where her mother still sat safely in view, Marian realized with a terrifying clarity that her plan to guard her heart was already failing. The weariness she had seen in him the night before was entirely gone, replaced by a vibrant, engaged energy. Gideon paused at the base of the terrace steps, turning to face her fully. The morning sun caught the silver in his dark hair, and his eyes were dark and intent. "Miss Linfield," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly over the rustle of the garden leaves. "Your work is nothing short of remarkable. I should very much like to understand it better." He paused, and a flicker of genuine vulnerability crossed his features. A man asking for a favor he was not certain he would receive. "Would you grant me permission to visit your school? I wish to see the fruits of your labor firsthand." Marian stared at him, her heart hammering a frantic, echoing rhythm against her ribs. He was not asking for a dance in a crowded ballroom. He was asking to step into her private world, to intertwine his life with the very core of who she was. "Yes, Your Grace," she breathed, entirely unable to deny him. "You would be most welcome." The parish school of St. Jude's stood in stark, unapologetic contrast to the gilded drawing rooms of Mayfair. Located in a narrow, soot-stained street where the air smelled eternally of coal smoke and damp wool, the brick building was a sanctuary of order amidst the chaotic clamor of the eastern districts. For Marian Linfield, the worn wooden floorboards and the scent of chalk dust were more comforting than the finest Parisian perfumes. Here, she was not the unfortunate, limping sister of a diamond of the first water, she was the architect of 50 young futures. And for the past 3 weeks, to her enduring astonishment, the Duke of Kenshire had become a quiet, steadfast fixture within this modest world. True to his word, Gideon had come to observe, and he had done so with the same profound respect he had shown her in the gardens. He did not arrive with a grand entourage, nor did he disrupt the delicate ecosystem of the classroom. Instead, he would sit his large frame at the back of the drafty room, his long legs stretched out beneath a child-sized desk, entirely absorbed in the rhythmic recitation of multiplication tables. When the school day ended, he lingered to discuss the curriculum with her, treating her ledgers and lesson plans with the gravity of parliamentary decrees. He was a man accustomed to wielding immense power, yet within the walls of St. Jude's, he willingly ceded all authority to her. As his visits became a cherished routine, Marian found herself fighting a daily, silent battle against her own heart. The warmth that bloomed in her chest whenever his carriage turned onto the cobblestones was undeniable, a sweet, dangerous ache that threatened to dismantle her hard-won peace. She found herself memorizing the exact shade of his dark eyes when he smiled, and the deep, reassuring cadence of his voice when he read to the younger children. But late at night, in the quiet solitude of her bedchamber, the heavy silver handle of her cane resting against her nightstand served as a cruel anchor to reality. She was a woman of physical limitations, built for quiet corners and gentle days. A duke, especially a Duke of Kenshire's standing, required a duchess who could host royalty, stand for hours in receiving lines, and carry the immense social weight of his ancient title with effortless grace. Marian knew, with a painful, pragmatic certainty, that she could never be that woman. She was merely a temporary respite for a weary man, an intellectual diversion he would eventually leave behind when the duties of his station called him to choose a proper bride. This internal war was raging particularly fiercely on a brisk Tuesday afternoon as Marian stood beside her heavy oak desk, reviewing the monthly expenditures. Gideon stood a few paces away, quietly examining a map of the world she had recently procured for the older students. The peaceful silence was abruptly shattered by the heavy tread of boots in the corridor, followed by the unceremonious arrival of Mr. Sterling, a pompous, red-faced local magistrate who held a small seat on the parish board. Sterling had long viewed Marian's management of the school with a mixture of patronizing amusement and thinly veiled irritation, believing that a wealthy young woman playing at charity was bound to make a mess of the neighborhood's economy. "Miss Linfield," Sterling barked, not bothering to remove his hat as he strode into the room. "I have just reviewed your proposal for the boys' carpentry apprenticeships, and I must say it is entirely out of the question. The parish cannot sustain such frivolous expenditures, and I will not have you confusing these children above their station." Before Marian could formulate a measured response, Sterling caught sight of the tall, impeccably dressed gentleman turning away from the map. The magistrate's bluster instantly evaporated, replaced by a fawning, desperate obsequiousness. He snatched his hat from his head, bowing low. "Your Grace, I had no idea you were gracing our humble parish with your presence. It is an honor, a profound honor. As you can see, I am attempting to untangle the administrative confusion here. The young lady means well, of course, with her delicate constitution, but the complexities of parish funding are hardly suitable for the feminine mind." A cold, terrifying silence descended upon the classroom. Marian felt a flush of deep humiliation creep up her neck. She gripped the edge of her desk, bracing herself for the inevitable moment when Gideon would step forward, assume the mantle of his aristocratic authority, and manage the situation on her behalf. It was what any gentleman of the era would do, rescue the fragile woman from the unpleasantness of business. But Gideon did not move to stand in front of her. He did not raise his voice, nor did he offer the magistrate the polite, dismissive agreement expected of men discussing the limitations of women. Instead, he stepped slowly to Marian's side, deliberately aligning himself slightly behind her right shoulder, presenting a united front where she was the undisputed vanguard. "Mr. Sterling, is it?" Gideon's voice was perilously soft, carrying the unmistakable, icy edge of a man whose authority was absolute and terrifying to behold. "I confess I am baffled by your address. You speak to me of administrative confusion, yet I am not the administrator of this institution. You stand before the sovereign authority of St. Jude's." Sterling blinked, his face flushing a deeper shade of crimson as he looked frantically between the Duke's stony expression and Marian's startled one. "Your Grace, I only meant what you meant, Mr. Sterling, is of little interest to me." Gideon interrupted smoothly, his gaze fixed on the magistrate with a chilling intensity. "What does interest me is your astonishing failure to recognize brilliance when it is presented to you in perfectly balanced ledgers. Miss Linfield's proposal for the apprenticeships is not only financially sound, it is an economic triumph that surpasses anything I have seen debated in the House of Lords this session. If you possess questions regarding her methodology, you will address them to her, with the profound respect her intellect and her station command." Gideon paused, allowing the silence to stretch until the magistrate visibly trembled. "And should you ever again speak of Miss Linfield's delicate constitution as a metric for her capability, you will find that the Kenshire estate has a very long, very unforgiving memory. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" "Abundantly, Your Grace." Profoundly clear, Sterling stammered, bowing awkwardly toward Marian. "Miss Linfield, I shall review the proposal again. Good day to you." "Good day, Your Grace." The magistrate practically fled the room, his boots clattering noisily down the corridor until the heavy front door slammed shut behind him. In the ringing silence that followed, Marian let out a shaky breath, her fingers slowly releasing their death grip on the edge of the desk. She turned to look at Gideon, her heart swelling with an emotion so vast and powerful it threatened to consume her. He had not rescued her. He had empowered her. He had not shielded her behind his title. He had used his title to force the world to see her exactly as she was. "You did not have to do that," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of her unshed tears. "I am entirely accustomed to managing Mr. Sterling." Gideon looked down at her, the icy fury he had directed at the magistrate melting instantly into a gaze of such intense, burning warmth that Marian had to lean slightly on her cane to steady herself. "I know you are," he said softly, "but you should never have to tolerate the insolence of lesser men simply because they are too blind to see your worth." He did not push the matter further, nor did he demand her gratitude. He simply helped her gather her ledgers, his large hands moving with quiet efficiency, before offering to escort her to her carriage. The walk out into the crisp afternoon air was silent, but the space between them hummed with a thick, electric tension that had not been there an hour prior. When they reached the street, her driver opened the carriage door and lowered the small iron step. Marian moved to ascend, but before she could grasp the doorframe to balance her uneven weight, Gideon stepped close. In the middle of the bustling, soot-stained street, in broad daylight, the Duke of Kenshire did something breathtakingly intimate. He deliberately unfastened the pearl button at his wrist and pulled the supple leather glove from his right hand, tucking it into his pocket. He then reached out, his bare, warm hand closing firmly over her gloved fingers. The shock of the skin-to-cloth contact, a deeply personal gesture typically reserved for the privacy of courtship, sent a jolt of pure fire straight up Marian's arm. She gasped softly, her eyes flying to his face. He was not looking at the carriage step, nor was he looking at the street around them. His dark eyes were locked securely on hers, burning with an unmasked, undeniable devotion that stripped away every excuse she had ever invented to keep him at a distance. As he held her hand, supporting her weight effortlessly as she stepped up into the carriage, the prolonged pressure of his grip conveyed a silent, devastating vow. He was not a man seeking a friend, nor an intellectual diversion. He was a man laying siege to her heart, and he fully intended to conquer it. For 3 agonizing days following the incident at the carriage, the memory of Gideon's bare hand holding hers burned against Marian's mind like a brand. It was a beautiful, terrifying confirmation that the quiet Duke of Kenshire did not merely view her as a charitable colleague or an intellectual novelty. He saw her as a woman. Yet, as the heady intoxication of that skin-to-skin contact began to wane, the cold, unforgiving reality of their respective stations rushed in to fill the void. Within the soot-stained walls of St. Jude's, they were equals. But in the glittering, ruthless arena of Victorian high society, she was a woman whose physical limitations disqualified her from the very life he was bound by duty to lead. This silent, suffocating fear was given a devastating voice on a dreary Thursday afternoon. Marian had accompanied her mother and Flora to an intimate parlor tea hosted by a mutual acquaintance, seeking a few hours of mundane conversation to distract her racing mind. But the tea was far from mundane, for seated near the crackling hearth was Lady Agatha Vance, the Dowager Marchioness of Rothesay, and Gideon's formidable aunt. Lady Agatha was not a cruel woman, nor was she given to petty gossip. She possessed a chillingly pragmatic view of the world, rooted in decades of navigating the treacherous, demanding waters of the Tun. Halfway through the afternoon, as the other ladies debated the merits of a new dressmaker, Lady Agatha caught Marian's eye and gestured toward a velvet settee set slightly apart from the chatter. Marian navigated the crowded room with her cane, her heart sinking with every uneven step. She took her seat beside the older woman, bracing herself for judgment. But Lady Agatha did not sneer at her silver-handled cane, nor did she speak with malice. Her tone was gentle, almost sorrowful, which made her words infinitely more devastating. "My nephew is a profoundly serious man, Miss Linfield," Lady Agatha began quietly, her sharp, intelligent eyes studying Marian's face. "And he looks at you with a seriousness I have not seen in him since he inherited the coronet. I know of your work in the eastern districts. I know you possess a brilliant mind and a thoroughly gentle heart. In an ordinary world, you would make him exceptionally happy." Marian's breath hitched, her fingers tightening painfully around the handle of her cane. "But this is not an ordinary world, my lady." "No, it is not." The Dowager agreed softly. "The Duchy of Kenshire is not a romance, my dear. It is an office of state. To be his Duchess is a physical and social endurance that breaks even the most robust young women. It requires standing for 6 consecutive hours at royal levees with a heavy tiara cutting into your scalp. It means walking miles of drafty, endless corridors at the country estates, managing a staff of hundreds, and acting as the tireless, smiling face of a dynasty that expects perfection." Lady Agatha paused, letting the harsh realities settle into the space between them. "Can you, with your delicate constitution, physically bear that weight? Or will you, despite your deepest affections, inevitably falter and become an anchor around his neck?" Every single word struck Marian like a physical blow. The absolute lack of cruelty in Lady Agatha's assessment was what shattered her. It was not an insult. It was an undeniable, terrifying truth. Marian thought of the sharp, throbbing pain that radiated through her hip after merely navigating a crowded ballroom. She thought of the days she was forced to remain in bed, her body demanding a rest her spirit loathed. She loved Gideon. The realization bloomed in her chest not with joyful warmth, but with an agonizing, heavy sorrow. Because she loved him, she could not selfishly allow him to tether his magnificent life to a woman who would inevitably diminish it. When Marian quietly excused herself from the tea an hour later, her chest felt completely hollowed out. She was navigating the dimly lit corridor toward the cloakroom, desperate to escape to her carriage, when the heavy front doors opened. Gideon stepped into the foyer, his broad shoulders brushing off the afternoon drizzle. His dark eyes immediately scanned the shadows, and when they locked onto hers, his austere expression broke into that private, devastating warmth she had come to cherish above all else. He closed the distance between them, offering his arm to escort her. But Marian did not take it. She took a deliberate step backward, gripping her cane like a shield, creating an insurmountable physical and emotional distance between them. Gideon's smile faded instantly, replaced by a sharp, perceptive frown. "Marian, what has happened? You are pale." "Nothing has happened, Your Grace," she said, the formal title tasting like ash on her tongue. Her voice trembled, but she forced her spine to remain entirely rigid. "I am simply tired, and I am going home." He stepped closer, invading the polite distance she had tried to establish. "Let me take you. My carriage is waiting." No, the word slipped out sharper than she intended. A desperate defense mechanism against the overwhelming urge to lean against his chest and weep. She looked up at him, forcing herself to meet his confused, wounded gaze. "We must stop this, Gideon. Whatever this alliance is between us, it cannot continue." "Cannot continue?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Marian, what are you speaking of? If someone has insulted you, no one has insulted me. They have merely reminded me of what I already knew," she interrupted, her eyes burning with unshed tears as she gestured helplessly toward her right leg. "Look at me. Look at my reality. You are the Duke of Kenshire. You require a bride who can carry your title, who can stand by your side in receiving lines and host monarchs without collapsing from the effort. You need a woman of strength and stamina. I can barely carry my own weight on a damp day. Marian, please," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "Do not ask me to be the reason your life is diminished. I am withdrawing from your company, Your Grace. It is the only sensible conclusion for us both." Before he could argue, before he could deploy his formidable intellect to dismantle her defenses, Marian turned. She walked away from him as quickly as her uneven gait would allow, the erratic tapping of her cane echoing loudly against the marble floors, sounding like the breaking of her own heart. She spent the entire night staring at the ceiling of her bedchamber, mourning the loss of a future she had never truly possessed. She was prepared to return to her quiet, invisible life. She was prepared for the aching emptiness that would follow. What she was entirely unprepared for was the loud, authoritative knock on the front door of the Linfield estate at 10 o'clock the following morning. Marian was sitting in the drawing room, wrapped in a thick shawl, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted, when the heavy double doors were thrust open. Gideon Vance strode into the room without waiting to be properly announced by the flustered butler. He did not look like a polite gentleman making a morning call. He looked like a storm that had breached the harbor walls. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches from where she sat. He did not offer a bow. He simply looked her directly in the eye, his gaze burning with a fierce, unwavering intensity that pinned her to her seat. "I will hear no more talk of sensible conclusions, and I care nothing for what society deems a necessary constitution," Gideon stated plainly, his rich baritone ringing with absolute finality. "I am looking for a partner for my soul, Marian, not a mannequin for my family's jewels. And I am not leaving this room until you understand that you are the only woman who has ever possessed the strength to carry my heart." The absolute silence that followed Gideon's declaration was so profound that Marian could hear the erratic, frantic beating of her own heart. He stood before her, a titan of a man, his chest heaving slightly beneath his tailored waistcoat, his dark eyes stripping away every layer of armor she had spent her life painstakingly assembling. The rain from his unannounced journey still clung to his broad shoulders, filling the quiet drawing room with the sharp, clean scent of the autumn storm. Marian stared up at him, her throat painfully tight. She had expected anger at her abrupt dismissal the previous day, or perhaps a polite, dignified acceptance of their parting. She had never, in all her quiet years, prepared herself for the overwhelming force of a man fighting for her. "Gideon," she whispered, the informal use of his name slipping out like a prayer. "You do not understand the reality of what you are asking. The ton will tear you apart for choosing a bride who cannot stand beside you without a cane. They will pity you. Let them try, Gideon replied, his voice a low, fierce rumble. He did not hover over her. Instead, with a graceful deference that defied his massive frame, he slowly lowered himself until he was kneeling on the carpet directly in front of her chair. He ignored the rigid rules of propriety, reaching out to take both of her trembling hands in his large, warm palms. "Marian, look at me." She forced herself to meet his gaze, bracing herself against the raw, unmasked devotion burning in his eyes. "My estates are managed by stewards. My royal duties are handled by secretaries," Gideon said softly, his thumbs gently smoothing the sensitive skin of her knuckles. "I do not need a foot soldier to march through the corridors of Kenshire. Nor do I need a smiling ornament to appease the gossips of Mayfair. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who are physically flawless and entirely hollow. You are the only person who has ever seen the man beneath the coronet. You are the only woman who has ever matched my mind, challenged my assumptions, and held my heart." A solitary tear slipped down Marian's cheek, hot and unbidden. "But what if I falter? What if the physical toll is too much? Then we will sit down," he answered instantly, without a single heartbeat of hesitation. "If you cannot stand in a receiving line, we will receive our guests seated. If you cannot walk the length of the gardens, I will carry you, or we will remain by the fire. I would rather sit in a quiet room with you for the rest of my days than walk the breadth of the earth with anyone else." He pressed a brief, fiercely tender kiss to the back of her hands, his eyes never leaving hers. "I am not asking you to change who you are to fit my life, Marian. I am asking for the privilege of reshaping my life to fit you. But the choice, the courage to step into the light, must be yours. I will not force you." With those final, devastatingly respectful words, Gideon rose. He bowed to her, his expression a tapestry of hope and profound vulnerability, and took his leave, stepping back out into the rain and leaving the choice entirely in her hands. For an hour, Marian remained perfectly still in her chair, staring at the embers shifting in the hearth. The safety of her invisible life beckoned to her. It would be so easy to remain in the shadows, to retreat to her school and her ledgers where the world could not scrutinize her. But the thought of a life without Gideon's quiet laughter, without the thrilling spark of their debates, without the steady, anchoring warmth of his hand over hers, felt like a sudden, unbearable death. The soft rustle of silk broke her reverie. Her mother and Flora slipped quietly into the drawing room, their faces etched with gentle concern. They had not been in the room, but the Linfield household was a close-knit one. They knew the Duke had arrived in a tempest and left in silence. Flora, radiant and lovely in her morning gown, immediately crossed the room and sank onto the floor beside Marian's chair, resting her head affectionately against her sister's knee. "He loves you," Flora said softly, her voice entirely devoid of the jealousy or surprise that society would expect from a displaced belle of the season. "Anyone with eyes can see it. He loves a version of me that does not have to face the cruelty of the ton." Marian murmured, her fingers automatically dropping to stroke Flora's golden hair. "Lady Agatha was right, Flora. A duchess is a public monument. I am not built for such a display." "Marian Linfield, that is the most uncharacteristic nonsense I have ever heard you utter," her mother spoke up, stepping forward with a firm, unyielding grace. Mrs. Linfield took the seat opposite her daughter, her gaze a mirror of Marian's own sharp intellect. "You negotiate with stubborn magistrates. You command a classroom of 50 unruly children. You manage the accounts of this household with a precision that terrifies my bankers. Do you truly believe that a limp makes you fragile?" Marian looked at her mother, startled by the fierce pride in the older woman's voice. "Your physical limitations are a fact of your life, my darling, but they are not the sum of your character," her mother continued gently. "You have spent your life convincing yourself that you must be invisible so as not to be a burden. But the Duke of Kenshire does not see a burden. He sees a queen. The only question is whether you are finally brave enough to see her, too." The words struck a deep, resonating chord within Marian's soul. She looked down at the silver handle of her cane resting against the chair. It was not a shackle. It was the tool that had allowed her to walk through the world, to build her school, to reach the very gardens where she had fallen in love. Her fear was not truly of the physical demands of the duchy. Her fear was of being vulnerable, of allowing herself to be seen and judged. But Gideon was willing to stand between her and the judgment of the world. How could she offer him anything less than her absolute bravery in return? A sudden, overwhelming clarity washed over her, sweeping away the ashes of her insecurities. Marian sat up straighter, her spine aligning with a new, unbreakable resolve. "Flora," Marian said, her voice steady and clear, devoid of its previous tremor. "Fetch me my writing desk, if you please, and send word to the modist. The Earl of Harrington's final ball of the season is tomorrow evening, and I find I am in desperate need of a gown that commands the room." Flora's face broke into a dazzling, triumphant smile as she scrambled to her feet, rushing to do her sister's bidding. That evening, Marian sat at her desk, her hand steady as she dipped her pen into the inkwell. She did not write a long, agonizing treatise on her fears or her physical state. She wrote a single, elegant line on her heavy, lavender-scented stationery, claiming her worth and sealing her future. "Your Grace, if your offer of an escort still stands, I should very much like to attend the Harrington ball." The following evening, the Linfield townhouse was alive with a nervous electric energy. When the heavy brass knocker sounded, Marian was standing at the top of the grand staircase. She wore a gown of deep, luminous midnight blue velvet, a heavy, rich fabric that required no frivolous lace or bows. It draped elegantly over her frame, catching the light of the chandeliers, and in her right hand she held her silver-topped cane, not as a crutch to be hidden, but as a dignified extension of herself. The front doors opened, and Gideon stepped into the foyer. He was breathtaking in stark, formal evening wear, the dark coat and crisp white cravat highlighting the aristocratic lines of his jaw. He handed his hat to the butler, his gaze instantly sweeping upward. When he saw her, he froze. Every breath seemed to leave his powerful frame. The fierce, terrifying Duke of Kenshire looked entirely, beautifully undone. He did not wait for her to begin the arduous descent alone. He took the stairs 2 at a time, stopping on the step just below hers so that they were perfectly at eye level. "Marian," he breathed, his voice thick with a reverence that made her heart soar. "You are magnificent." Marian smiled, a true, radiant expression that illuminated her entire face, banishing the last lingering shadows of her invisible years. "I am ready, Gideon." His eyes filled with a quiet, fierce devotion that promised a lifetime of steady, unbreakable protection. He offered her his arm, entirely ignoring the customary polite distance. As Marian slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, leaning her weight trustingly into his solid strength, she knew they were not merely walking out to a carriage. They were stepping out to conquer the world. The Earl of Harrington's ballroom was a glittering, unforgiving theater of silk, diamonds, and ruthless social calculation. It was the undisputed pinnacle of the London season, a place where reputations were cemented or shattered beneath the blinding glare of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. As Marian stood in the grand vestibule, the sweeping strains of a waltz bleeding through the heavy gilded doors, a sudden, sharp wave of terror washed over her. For 26 years, she had navigated these spaces by clinging to the shadowed walls, wrapped tightly in the armor of her own invisibility. Now she was about to step directly into the brightest, most unforgiving light the Tun had to offer. Her fingers tightened involuntarily around the silver handle of her cane. Beside her, Gideon felt the slight, rigid shift in her posture. He did not ask if she was frightened, nor did he offer hollow platitudes about her beauty. Instead, he simply adjusted his stance, moving a fraction of an inch closer so that the solid, immovable warmth of his arm pressed reassuringly against hers. "They will stare, Marian," Gideon murmured, his deep voice a steady anchor in the chaotic swirl of her anxieties. He looked down at her, his dark eyes fiercely protective and infinitely tender. Let them see exactly who has claimed the heart of the Duke of Kenshire. They will look at you, but I promise you, my love, I will not let them look down on you. Marian took a slow, deep breath, letting the clean, masculine scent of his sandalwood soap ground her. She looked up into the face of the man who had seen her worth when the rest of the world had only seen her limitations. The terror receding, she found a deep, quiet well of courage rising to take its place. She was Marian Linfield. She managed accounts that baffled magistrates, she shaped the minds of children, and she was entirely, profoundly loved by the greatest man she had ever known. "I am ready," she said softly, loosening her death grip on her cane and resting her left hand lightly, gracefully upon his arm. The heavy doors were pulled open by a pair of liveried footmen. The major domo struck his staff against the marble floor, his booming voice cutting through the elegant chatter of the room. His Grace, Gideon Vance, the Duke of Kenshire. And Miss Marian Linfield. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. As Gideon and Marian stepped over the threshold, a profound, sweeping hush fell over the magnificent room. Hundreds of heads turned in synchronized shock. The whispering began almost immediately, a frantic, buzzing undercurrent beneath the music. Dowagers snapped their fans shut in disbelief. Beautiful young debutantes stared in open-mouthed astonishment. They had expected the elusive Duke to finally present a bride, perhaps a flawless earl's daughter or a reigning diamond of the season. They had never, in their wildest imaginings, expected the quiet, limping sister who always stood in the shadows. Marian felt the physical weight of their collective shock pressing against her. For a fleeting second, the old urge to drop her head and shrink away flared to life. But Gideon did not allow it. He placed his large, warm hand over her gloved fingers resting on his forearm, a silent, powerful command to hold her ground. He kept his head high, his aristocratic features set in lines of absolute, unyielding pride as he escorted her down the shallow marble steps onto the main floor. As they reached the edge of the dance floor, the orchestra transitioned into a slow, sweeping waltz. Traditionally, this was the moment a duke would lead his chosen lady to the center of the room, initiating a complex, breathless dance to display their physical perfection and unity. Gideon did no such thing. He knew the swift, sweeping turns of the waltz would cause her pain, and he refused to subject her to a spectacle that would highlight her uneven gait. Instead, with deliberate, breathtaking grace, he turned to her and offered a deep, formal bow right there at the edge of the floor. Marian, her heart swelling with an emotion so fierce it brought tears to her eyes, returned the gesture with a shallow, perfectly executed curtsy. Then, rather than stepping onto the dance floor, Gideon placed her hand securely back upon his arm. With the eyes of the entire British aristocracy fixed upon them, the Duke of Kenshire and his future Duchess began to walk. They promenaded slowly around the perimeter of the vast ballroom. Gideon seamlessly, effortlessly shortened his long stride, matching his pace entirely to the rhythmic, uneven tap of her silver cane. He did not look at the stunned faces of the ton as they parted like the Red Sea to let them pass. He looked only at Marian. He leaned in, his dark head tilted toward hers, engaging her in quiet, private conversation, smiling at her softly as though they were the only two people in the universe. It was a masterclass in absolute social dominance. By refusing to rush, by refusing to hide her pace, Gideon forced the entire room to accommodate them. He was telling society, in a language louder than any proclamation, that his world now moved at the pace of Marian Linfield, and they would all simply have to adjust. As they completed their circuit, the whispers of shock began to change. The pity and the confusion evaporated, replaced by a dawning, reluctant awe. They saw the way the Duke looked at her, not as a charitable obligation, but as a queen he was profoundly honored to serve. And they saw Marian, her spine straight, her chin high, radiating a quiet, magnificent dignity in her midnight blue velvet. By the time they reached the far end of the room, a reigning duchess stepped forward, offering Marian a warm, respectful smile and a deep nod of acknowledgement. The battle was won. 1 year later, the late afternoon sun cast a warm golden haze over the expansive, immaculately manicured gardens of the Kenshire country estate in Somerset. The air was thick with the sweet, heavy scent of blooming climbing roses and the gentle drone of honeybees. Marian, the Duchess of Kenshire, sat upon a smooth, curved stone bench situated perfectly beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree. The bench had not been there a year ago. Gideon had quietly ordered a dozen of them placed at regular intervals along her favorite walking paths, ensuring she could explore the vast grounds without ever fearing the sudden onset of exhaustion. Spread across her lap was a heavy, leather-bound ledger. St. Jude's had not only survived her transition to Duchess, it had flourished. With the immense resources of the Kenshire estate behind her, she had opened 3 new schools across the eastern districts and established a comprehensive apprenticeship program that was rapidly becoming a model for progressive reform in Parliament. She paused in her calculations, the faint, rhythmic crunch of gravel alerting her to her husband's approach. Gideon walked down the garden path, his coat discarded somewhere in the manor, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, capable forearms. The severe exhaustion that had once haunted his features in the London ballrooms was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, settling peace that made him look younger and infinitely more handsome. He stopped before her, a slow, devastatingly warm smile spreading across his face as he looked at the ledgers. "Are you plotting a hostile takeover of the Crown's treasury, Your Grace, or merely balancing the accounts for the new roof at St. Jude's?" "The roof, for now," Marian replied, her eyes sparkling with quiet amusement as she closed the heavy book. "Though if the magistrate gives my headmistress any further grief, I make no promises regarding the treasury." Gideon laughed, the rich, resonant sound filling the quiet garden. He reached out, taking the ledger from her lap and setting it aside on the bench. Then, with deliberate, practiced intimacy, he unfastened the buttons of his cuffs and reached for her hands. His long, warm fingers intertwined with hers, his thumbs gently stroking the gold band resting perfectly alongside the magnificent Kenshire sapphire on her left hand. "Walk with me?" he asked softly. "Always," she answered. He helped her to her feet, his hands steady and entirely secure. Marian reached for her silver-handled cane, and together they stepped out onto the wide, sunlit path. There was no need for conversation, no need for the glittering artifice of society. They moved forward together, the powerful Duke and his brilliant, gentle Duchess, their steps perfectly, beautifully matched, entirely secure in the profound, unbreakable sanctuary of their love.